If you could take your seats, we're going to get started for our second and final session. We've been joined by some additional people I should mention. We're very pleased to have with us Her Majesty Queen Noor of Jordan, also Ambassador Tom Korologos, our former ambassador to Belgium, Senator Kit Bond, who was already mentioned, the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Judge William Webster, the former director of the FBI and the CIA. With that, I'm very pleased to begin, as I say, our second session, which will focus on terrorism and counterterrorism. And we're pleased to have leading that session for us an old friend of the Aspen Institutes and of the Aspen Security Forums in particular, and no stranger to any of us, Kimberly Dozier. Kimberly is a contributor to the Daily Beast, and she is a global security correspondent for CNN and a former correspondent at the Associated Press and CBS News. As some of you know, she's just finishing up a year in academia as the General Omar Bradley Chair, which is a joint initiative among the United States War College, Army War College, Dickinson, and Penn State. And she's the recipient, as we know, of many journalism awards. And for those of us here in Washington, which I'm sure is nearly all of us in the room, we know that she's also a very engaged member of the Council on Foreign Relations. With that, Kimberly Dozier, who will lead us in our conversation with Matt Olsen, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center.
Thank you, Clark. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And I want to introduce Matt Olsen, who all of you already know, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, former lead counsel for NSA, among the many jobs that he's had in the national security world. He also holds the distinction of being known as the nicest guy in the business. And I had this term repeated to me by both Republicans and Democrats. You are known as someone who can walk into a room of competing factions and screaming, arguing people and bring the tone down and get people to kind of see eye to eye. So with that spirit in mind, I'll ask you some tough questions
Excellent.
today.
Yeah, great. See if we can change that reputation.
Yeah, he's getting feistier now that he's out. I'm hoping to bring that out here. So now you're also working at the technology startup with General Alexander called IronNet, another mention of that today, on cybersecurity technology. And I wanted to point out to everyone that Matt wrote an article today, an editorial in Politico on Eric Holder's legacy on the war on terror. So we'll be touching on that a little bit later. But I want to start out with, we have an increasingly complex terrorist threat, Americans being drawn to militancy overseas, and nation states dissolving, ungoverned spaces multiplying. What's our strategy?
Right, so I'll delay for a minute while I think about that. I mean, it's customary to thank Clark and the Aspen Institute for doing this, and so I appreciate having the opportunity to be here. I would say, Clark, I know you said that this is going to happen other places overseas. I hope the fact that I'm doing this here in DuPont Circle doesn't foreclose the possibility of me going to London or Paris or wherever else you're going to take this roadshow. And as you say, Kim, I mean, this is a really complicated problem, and it's getting more complicated. It's interesting to me, so I'm following Keith Alexander, right? Cyber first, terrorism second. And I used to have this conversation with Director Clapper every winter when he'd get ready to appear before Congress with the worldwide threat hearing. And he would talk about, what order to rank the threats. And often, in the last actually 3 years in a row, the number one threat was cyber, reflected sort of how we are ordered here today, cyber first and terrorism second. I actually think I understand the reason to put cyber up there. It's as an emerging threat, but I think as a matter of the threats to our country and to our interests and to U.S. persons, whether abroad or here in the United States, that the threat from terrorism is our number one threat and remains that, and actually is becoming more complicated in the ways that you just described. So before I touch on strategy, and that's kind of a longer set of questions. What does that threat look like today, and why is it more complicated? And I'll just talk about that for a moment. I think it's more complicated in part because the threat's much more diverse, and this has been a theme for the last several years, but it's really, I think, come home in the last year. That is, we're not focused just on a monolithic threat in the Fatah, right? We're not just focused on Al Qaeda leadership. We now have a diverse number of threats that has proliferated In terms of the types of groups we're talking about, obviously AQAP in Yemen remains probably at the top of the list, but ISIS in Syria has seized our attention. The formation of smaller groups that are focused externally in Syria. The Khorasan group is the lead there. And then groups all over, in both East Africa and North Africa. So the diversity of groups, some are focused on us and attacking us, some are focused on regional goals, but they may soon turn their attention to the West. That's one way in which it's become more complicated. It's also become more complicated just because of the geographic spread across those areas that I mentioned, as well as the way in which they're changing tactics. So I think the first thing to really talk about, and this is what we did at the National Counterterrorism Center, is really, before we talk about strategy, let's really be precise about the threat and where are our interests implicated, and where do we need to focus our resources, because they're not unlimited.
Well, putting my CNN analyst hat on, a recent poll showed that the American public is afraid of ISIS, or ISIL, as most in government still call them, the Islamic State in the Levant. Is that the thing we should most fear as American citizens?
So I think the answer, if for a very sophisticated audience like this, and it's great to be among so many friends here, but the answer is no. In terms of what we should be most concerned about, we need to be very concerned about ISIS, don't get me wrong. They see us as a strategic enemy. They have said that they will turn their attention to us. They do seek to carry out attacks, certainly in the West, Europe, and potentially here in the United States. But in terms of an operational capability to carry out a significant attack here in the United States, I don't think they have that right now. They seek to recruit, and certainly they are very effective at propagating an ideology that motivates small numbers, individuals, maybe groups of very small groups, to potentially carry out small-scale attacks. But it's not, to my mind, what I would be most concerned about if I were still in my old job at NCTC.
It would be Al Qaeda?
It would be Al Qaeda. It would be Al Qaeda primarily in Yemen, and particularly given what's happening in Yemen.
Even though right now the airport in Yemen got destroyed, according to reports out of the country today. So can they project power right now? Or are they too busy being involved with that civil war?
No, I think, in fact, the civil war, the insurgency in Yemen, the fall of the government there, creates a more dangerous situation for the United States and for the West, because it creates more of that safe haven. And this is a theme that we see across not just Yemen, but obviously in Syria and in parts of Iraq, Somalia, Libya. The theme there is that as there is a lack of governance, a lack of security in these areas, but Yemen, first among them, gives these groups the freedom to operate, to train, to plan, and plot attacks. And AQAP has been the group that's shown the most intent and the most capability to project their power and to try to carry out a significant attack against us.
So that brings us back to that question you haven't quite answered. What's our strategy?
Right. So the strategy's hard, right? The strategy's hard, and one point is that it's a long-term strategy. It doesn't fit the CNN 24-hour news cycle, because that will reflect the latest beheading, the latest kidnapping, which does understandably evoke a sense of vulnerability and fear. Totally understand that. But the strategy that we need to think about is really generational, and it is to on one hand maintain our capabilities in terms of counterterrorism operations.
So you're talking about maintaining our ability to target individuals, but how about targeting the overall instability or...
Right. So you only let me get out one part of my answer, Kim. So I'm just getting started. But yes, you're right. So yes, maintain our ability to target individuals, groups that pose a threat to us. But longer term, it is to address the underlying instability and the ideology. And those are kind of tiered, like in terms of how quickly we can impact those, how quickly we can have an impact, right? We can have a short and tangible impact in terms of counterterrorism operations. It's a longer term proposition to develop stability and capability in countries where terrorists have a safe haven, and then it's probably even a longer term proposition to change the way people think.
Do we have the resources as a nation to do that?
we've devoted obviously a significant amount of resources over the last 14 years, 15 years, and I think at least just looking at nuts and bolts budget, counterterrorism budget is sort of flattened out over the last several years at the National Counterterrorism Center, where we were a part of the apparatus to help devise that budget and oversee it, and it was pretty flat over the last few years. And I think, to my mind, that's a lot of resources put into counterterrorism. I don't think we need to keep increasing it significantly, but I think it's going to be a substantial investment to maintain the capabilities that we've developed, both operationally, but also to build that capacity that's necessary in countries like Libya and Somalia and Iraq.
Yet in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, where we have invested billions of dollars, not just in the counterterrorism network within those countries, but also in the governance, the providing food, water, good sort of governing capabilities to those local peoples, it doesn't seem to have worked.
Right, and I think it hasn't worked in the time period that we're looking at. I think is the way I would think about it. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and maybe sometimes 3 or 4 steps back. But it's the right thing to do, and it's the way that we're going to ultimately change the equation in these countries.
So that leads to 2 questions. Does it matter what you call those who present the threat? Criminal extremism versus calling them Islamic militants?
Right. So you posit a term that I've never used, criminal extremism. I mean, I understand what you mean. You this sort of, what's the right terminology, and the criticism that people are reluctant to use the word Islamic extremists. I mean, for one, I've never been, I was in office, right, and I was never told, or no one suggested not to use the term Islamic extremism, and we use that term at NCTC. But I think the more careful answer, the more thoughtful answer is, well, for one, we need to understand the roots of the ideology, and we need to understand the extent to which there's a religious basis for what we see in Al Qaeda, right? We're at war with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is our enemy. We need to understand what is the ideology there. In what ways does that ideology help us understand their tactics, how they recruit? And we spend a lot of time at NCTC, our analysts, studying that ideology so that we can defeat it. And there's no sort of political correctness about how we talk about it. I can assure you.
And yet the White House has said publicly that their Arab allies especially have asked them not to use that term, and so they don't use it publicly. It's been a real bone of contention on Capitol Hill. People like retired DIA Chief Lieutenant General Mike Flynn has said you've got to call it what it is in order to devise a strategy to defeat it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a false issue. I mean, I've not heard, I'm obviously familiar with what General Flynn said, but I've heard the president talk about what Al Qaeda puts out as a perversion of Islam, right? It's a distortion of the religion. There's no reluctance to talk about the religious underpinnings of what Al Qaeda seeks to propagate. I do think it's important that we not fall into the trap of thinking about this as a religious war, or that it's basically a war of West versus East, or Muslims versus the rest of the world. I mean, remember, the vast majority of the people that are being killed in Syria and Iraq and other places are Muslims. This war is not at its heart religious based. We do need to understand the religious underpinnings to the ideology so that we can understand how they recruit and better counter that message. But again, I kind of think this is a false issue that it didn't affect anything that we did at NCTC, and I don't see it affecting our strategy at all.
Okay, so if you're not so concerned about what you call them, how do you stop their appeal to American citizens, to citizens overseas? Right, supposedly they're drawing, and ISIS is drawing still thousands of new recruits every month.
Right, I mean, it's obviously a huge problem. You look at the number of foreign fighters traveling to Syria to join in the conflict there and join ISIS, and they're very effective at putting out their message. I mean, we need to continue, and we need to invest in this aspect of our strategy, which is countering violent extremism, and part of that is to amplify the moderate Islamic leaders' voices, right? We need to find the clerics and the leaders who are out there talking, and we need to put in the resources to help them put their message out. And that's look, that's a explicit, understanding, explicitly understanding that there's a religious basis to the message, at least that they seek to use, right? So again, that's why I think that this idea that we don't talk about Islamic extremism is kind of a false point.
But do we discredit them simply by helping them? And the other question is, will the U.S. always end up being a foil in this fight between moderate versus militant Islam?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, in other words, if this is a fight that's happening within that religion or within that part of the world, and attacking the U.S. becomes something to use as a rallying cry,
I get you.
how much can we have an effect?
I mean,
on
I do
that?
think we need to be somewhat humble about the degree to which we can affect, especially when we work as, openly as the U.S. government. The U.S. government is not necessarily the best messenger, but we can have an impact, I think, by working with our allies in the region, certainly, and by investing in, again, amplifying those voices that are revealing the falsity of ISIS's message.
Now, there is something that we'd also talked about. This is a vast operation that you're talking about on multiple levels. It requires the Pentagon, the State Department, the FBI, DOJ, all working in concert. I've had many U.S. officials express their frustration that the bottleneck is the NSC. Is this fight being micromanaged by the White House?
It's shocking to me that people would come to you, Kim, and tell you things about what's happening inside the government. So look, it's a vast enterprise, and that's actually a strength. I think the teamwork that I saw happen inside government when it comes to a whole range of counterterrorism efforts, particularly operations, where the intelligence community working with the military, working with law enforcement. I mean, this is something that we strove to achieve, after 9/11, where we didn't have that level of teamwork and collaborative working together. So a specific example is Abu Qatala. This is a guy involved charged with being part of the attack in Benghazi. He's in jail, not about 5 miles from here. He's going to face trial in the U.S. District Courthouse down the street in D.C. That was that operation, the intelligence community identifying where he was in Benghazi, where he was staying in this villa on the beach. The military operation, which no other country in the world can even imagine, putting people on shore in the middle of the night and grabbing him and taking him off out onto a ship in the Mediterranean, turning him over to the FBI where he's then faces prosecution. That was all with the White House sort of bringing us all together. So
And
I just don't see that. Look, it took a while. It was hard, but it should be hard. And we need to think carefully when we do things like that.
So you don't think that they get pulled off of the current mission by the next bright, shiny object or next horrible beheading
I do think that's a natural thing, and I do think there is a risk there.
Okay.
So, and I do think I saw that with respect to ISIS. I don't know if it undermined other things we were doing, but I think inevitably with the National Security Council, they are going to be reacting to what CNN and others are putting on the news, because that's what the American people care about. And that is a bit of a risk. I think the vast majority of the enterprise, the counterterrorism community, has got their nose down and is plowing ahead, which is what I think the American people would expect.
And I don't think they realize this, but he's also neatly segued from my question about the White House, which kind of bashes the NSC, to his article about Eric Holder and his legacy, which included bringing Abu Qatala and others to trial. So tell us a little bit about how you think Eric Holder has affected the counterterrorism enterprise.
So I worked in the Justice Department with Holder, and as he was leaving, I was thinking about the idea that he's sort of viewed as having made mistakes and not achieved what he sought to achieve with respect to closing Guantanamo and particularly moving the 9/11 trial, 9/11 defendants to the United States, to New York City. And I think there's a sort of an unfair view of him as somewhat ideologically motivated, because what I saw was somebody who was very pragmatic. And so, and I thought the decisions that he made on both fronts, on both the prosecution of terrorists and how we handled that, and on trying to divide up the Guantanamo detainees among those who could be transferred as opposed to those who can't be transferred because they're too dangerous and can't be prosecuted. I saw a degree of sort of practical common sense pragmatism in his approach, and that was what I wrote about. I've got a bit of a bias probably because I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years here, and I've got a real strong belief in how well our federal courts can handle really complicated cases, and that's why I've seen how successful these cases have been in New York and here in the Eastern District of Virginia, and I was also in favor of trying the 9/11 case in New York City. So I think we probably would be not talking about that case anymore.
And now that I've let you talk about your article, let's talk about drones and drone policy, which is, I know, a difficult subject for you to discuss. But we've just had an American citizen and an Italian citizen killed accidentally in January in an unacknowledged CIA drone strike. It was referred to obliquely as a counterterrorism operation.
Right.
And also some other American citizens, at least one other American citizen who was on a list, but they just happened to get him in one of these operations. Does the drone policy need to be changed? Does the number of strikes need to be reined back? Do we need better intelligence before carrying one of these strikes out?
So one of the, I think obviously the tragic incident that you talked about that occurred several months ago and the president talked about last week, it does highlight that it's very difficult to have the exactly perfect intelligence, right? I mean, it's just very, very difficult to have that level of certainty that provides 100% assurance that you won't make a mistake when you carry out an operation. So, as the president said, there's going to be a review of the drone policy and of how we carry out counterterrorism operations. I was in the administration when the current standards were developed and then announced by the president in 2013 in his speech at the National Defense University. And to my mind, it's hard to imagine a more careful and demanding, rigorous standard for counterterrorism operations, in particular talking about drone operations, for example, in places like Yemen, where the standard for even being able to target somebody is that they pose a continuing and imminent threat to U.S. persons. And then before you can carry out that operation, you have to be sure that you can't feasibly carry out a rescue operation. And then third, that you have to reach near certainty that there won't be civilians, non-militants, injured, killed in the operation. And so that's a very demanding, very rigorous standard, and now sort of codified in the president's policy.
But does this mean when they hit what they thought was an Al Qaeda safe house, that they just assume anyone in Al Qaeda is an imminent threat, or do they have to be aware of a plot in that case?
Right, so I can't really talk, and I'm not going to talk about that specific,
Okay,
that
why don't we
specific one,
talk
but
about
in general,
strikes
right?
in
In
Yemen?
general, if you had a strike, a drone strike, for example, in Yemen, where we've talked about the fact that we do have drone strikes.
Do you want me to interrupt with as you probably all know, but just going over this territory? In Pakistan, the drone strikes are carried out by the CIA. In Yemen, we have both the CIA and DoD, Pentagon forces carrying out those strikes side by side. So that gives you a little bit more freedom to talk about those operations.
Right, so I can talk about the military operations in Yemen. And they're right. So what I laid out as the standard applies to the operation as a whole. So there has to, and it's done with a high degree of intelligence support for those operations before a decision can be made to go forward with the operation.
And yet there's something called a signature strike, where you're looking at the behavior of the group. You don't know the identities of the group. How does that meet the burden of proof? How is that imminent threat?
So one of the questions that I think is really hard, and we've spent a lot of time with, is this idea of what's an imminent threat. And that's sometimes I'd be in these meetings and I'd be asked because I'm a lawyer, there'd be other lawyers, and sort of what does imminent mean? And I think the point is imminent can be, and John Brennan's talked about this. I think it might mean something slightly more less demanding in the context of a group like Al Qaeda, as opposed to how you might in your everyday life think about imminent. The way I think about it, and I think the way we talked about it in these operations is there anything more that has to happen for this group to be able to carry out an attack? I mean, have they done what they need to do? And we may not have another opportunity to do something that would stop them from carrying out an attack. And I think that's the way in which we talk about, do they pose an imminent threat? And I look, I think that's a concept that's well grounded in the legal concept of imminence in a number of different contexts. And I think it's one that is quite justifiable. Certainly meets any international legal standard. It also, I think, to me, from an operational standpoint, is also, while demanding, can be met in the right cases.
Yet the fact that now they have side-by-side operations, DOD and CIA, when people like me try to find out the details of a strike, U.S. officials tell us, I'm sorry, we still can't tell you anything because if we give you details on one and not on the other one, well, we'd be telling you which ones were done by the CIA, and that would be telling you something classified, so we can't tell you anything still. And in the meantime, you have Al Qaeda on the ground pumping out information, photographs of dead civilians, and saying that was a U.S. strike. What do you do to combat that if you're tying yourselves up in these classification knots and not releasing that information?
Right, so again, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of all of what you just said, Kim. I mean, I understand your point. I think that, one point I would say is that, as the President's talked about, sort of moving everything over to Title X or to the military side in terms of these operations is something that's in the works. I think from my perspective at NCTC, one of the main things was to be as precise as we can, given the intelligence, to make sure that these operations meet the demanding standards that are imposed, and then I think the other thing that I would point to is how effective they've been. Our counterterrorism operations have been very effective in removing Al Qaeda leaders from the battlefield, and without really the types of other innocent people, civilians being killed as you would have in conventional type of operations.
And yet, to play devil's advocate, do you have any way to measure what they've done in terms of changing public opinion on the ground and helping ISIS and others recruit?
I mean, I would say to that it's a concern that we have considered, and I think the analysts that I worked with at NCTC, we were constantly looking at that question because it's a relevant question, right?
And how do you measure it?
Well, you measure it, and there's a lot of ways to measure it, actually, both through sort of specific anecdotal information,
share.
but more
It's
general
okay.
information.
But
it's it's a question we need to always be considering.
Okay. With that, I will, with that polite bunt, I will open it to the crowd. Ken Delanian from the AP.
Thanks, Kim.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry, thanks. Following up on that, on the drones issue, one of the things raised by that errant Pakistan strike, in my mind, was the question of capture operations. Why wasn't a capture operation considered? What goes into that? Can you, I know you can't talk about Pakistan, where, by the way, the near certainty standard, as I understand it, is not in place, as opposed to Yemen, right? Confirm or deny. But can you talk in general about, in the context of Yemen, or what does it mean when we say a capture operation isn't feasible?
Yeah. I mean, it is anytime these operations occur, that's something that's considered. Is there a capability to carry out a capture operation? I mean, from the perspective of intelligence gathering, it's much better to get a capture, right? To capture one of these individuals and have the opportunity to interrogate them and learn from them. So the question is that feasible? And that's just a common sense sort of judgment with a lot of input from the military and the intelligence community. What's the risk to U.S. forces and U.S. personnel in carrying out an operation? What's the nature of the environment in which they'd be operating? And that's what makes it so hard, because obviously, as you know, where we're carrying out these operations, they are largely denied to U.S. personnel. So that's what makes capture often so hard, although I think we have shown over the last several years that where there is an opportunity, we've undertaken really risky capture operations.
Well, that's what's so puzzling, right? When you see an Abu Qatala kind of operation, you wonder, well, why wasn't that attempted? And do political considerations, where the country is, does that play a role in feasibility question?
Where the country is?
If it's Pakistan versus Yemen.
I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, I think whether the feasibility question largely turns on the safety of U.S. forces. Is something that we could actually undertake without putting undue risk to our personnel.
Sir in the back.
Thank you. My question, I think, will make me pretty quickly identified as the idiot in the room. But I'd like to go back to your point earlier, which is the United States is often a foil, was a phrase that you used, very descriptive. But when you do a strategy, at least in the corporate world, you identify goals that are reasonable, and then you put in place some activities that go and chase those goals. Is it considered reasonable that we're ever going to get all these people to play nice, ever? And if the answer to that is low probability, perhaps even no chance, then shouldn't at least one of the objectives be for us to get the heck out of the Middle East, period, and not be the foil?
Well, so, you know, I think just on I think the first part of your question maybe is easier for me to answer. But I don't think the goal is every single person. Or, you know, our strategy is not premised on changing the hearts and minds of every single person, right? So the goal is to mitigate the risks that we face from terrorism to an acceptable level and protect American interests and American personnel. So from that perspective, I think we have a realistic approach, as opposed to sort of when you kind of posit that sounds inherently unrealistic. So that we then match our methods to that more realistic goal of again mitigating the risk and the threat that we'll face. But we're going to continue to face threats from terrorism. We have, for generations in the past, and we'll continue going forward.
And yet mitigating the risk sounds very different than what the White House says, which is with reference to ISIS, that they want to degrade and defeat ISIS. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean it is. It certainly is possible, but it's going to take a long time, and it's not.
In our lifetime?
Sure, in our lifetime. ISIS as a group, yeah, absolutely. But there will still be remnants of that group, or follow-on groups, or other individuals that will continue to pose a threat to us in some fashion, and it may morph, it may change, and we will be continued to be challenged to mitigate the risk. Sounds quite clinical, right? It's not the rhetoric maybe that would be chosen by somebody in a larger group or less sophisticated group perhaps than this. But I do think we are, to a certain degree, as we look at the challenges, we have to consider how do we manage this risk? How do we mitigate it to a point that it's acceptable? Because again, we're not talking about unlimited resources to put at this problem.
Catherine Herridge.
Thanks for taking my question. Do you believe that Libya is already a safe haven for ISIS and has the ability to launch regional attacks in the same way Al Qaeda used Afghanistan pre-9/11?
So I'm watching the same now information you are, Catherine. Now that I'm out, Catherine, I
that makes
don't
me
have
feel good.
the actual answer to that question. There are people who are in this room maybe who have a better understanding of exactly what's going on the ground in Libya. I do think that that's a risk. I do think we need to be mindful as Libya continues to suffer and be subject to such a high degree of unrest and turmoil that ISIS will seek to increase its presence there. It already has that sort of foothold, more than a toehold, I think foothold. But whether I wouldn't put it right now, at least, anywhere near sort of Afghanistan, pre-9/11 Afghanistan for ISIS. And also, at least right now, ISIS is less focused on the West than us, at least for the time being. But I do think it's a risk. I think it's it's a failed state like Libya poses a real risk to become a place from which terrorists could seek to carry out attacks, particularly in Europe.
But how about Al Qaeda in Libya?
Al Qaeda in Libya, there's a whole range of extremist groups in Libya, right? The presence of true sort of hardcore Al Qaeda, I think, is relatively limited compared to groups that are sort of aligned with Al Qaeda, and among ISIS is sort of, I put in that category.
Are they cooperating together, or do they work together when it's convenient, or help each other out with resources, weapons, manpads?
I mean, I would say that there's, again, I probably would call that a continuing risk that happens.
Okay. Josh.
Hey, Matt, Josh Gerstein with Politico. I wanted to, we haven't talked much about the domestic side of this
Right.
Battle, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, especially given your hat as a former federal prosecutor. There have been a lot of these cases of ISIS wannabes, or maybe people that were connected to ISIS or wanting to travel to the region. We've also had this series of cases in recent years of sting operations that the FBI has run for people that apparently went on the internet and tried to make contact with Al Qaeda groups or AQAP or whatever. Is that strategy in that form sustainable going forward? Because it has produced a lot of resentment, some of those cases, in particularly the Muslim community. I'm just curious, as someone who's looked at this both from what's happening on the ground in the Middle East and as a prosecutor, what your take is on whether there's anything else the U.S. government or anybody in the U.S. could be doing to address the domestic recruitment issue in some way that's something between, say, propaganda and full-scale law enforcement operations.
Yes, you packed a lot in that one, Josh. I mean, so obviously, this is a big issue. The recruitment in the United States is demonstrating the reach that ISIS has. The efforts to identify individuals who are Americans who are seeking to travel to Syria and join ISIS, and the number of arrests, right? It's been a couple dozen or more this year alone. They had that big arrest of like 9 people, I think, in Minnesota. There was an arrest of a guy from Ohio who had gone to Syria. Probably looks like he may have trained with al-Nusra and returned. I think he's the first one of the problem that we've identified, been concerned about for some time, of someone actually traveling, getting trained, and radicalized further and coming home, and then having a specific plan. So this is going to be this is a real problem now. It's going to continue to be a problem. It's a problem, I think, while it's growing in terms of numbers, and not unexpectedly, it's also it's not a problem, not a significant problem in terms of the scale of the types of attacks. I think we need to keep some perspective on what these individuals are capable of. Look, it could be lethal. It could be something like what we saw in Paris, but it's not, it's not on the scale of 9/11 or even Mumbai. And I think we need to kind of bear that in mind as we think about the threat. Now, on the question of our tactics, I think the FBI has done a fantastic job in identifying these individuals and arresting them. And I think their investigative techniques have stood up in court, without fail. That if they sort of sting operations, we're introducing an undercover against, there's been the allegation in most of these cases that there's been entrapment. Those defenses have not succeeded, and they're not really well grounded generally on the law of entrapment. But so they've been successful investigating and prosecuting these cases. So the third part of your question is sort of what about the broader implications of that approach with the Muslim community, on whom we need to rely to identify people, right, and to come forward, and we need to build trust. And there, I think that it's a harder question because we don't want the law enforcement community, the FBI, local police departments, to be viewed as the enemy by communities from which these individuals are being recruited. They need to work together. They need to trust each other, and that's not just a messaging issue. That's an issue that will continue to require real work on both sides. But I think, for my part, having been in the federal government, I do think there's been a pretty significant effort by FBI and the Justice Department and DHS to have more outreach, more education with communities that are the target for ISIS and other extremist groups, other Al Qaeda related groups.
Yet with each of these arrests, those who would join these groups learn what not to do. Is it inevitable that we will see more small-scale terrorist attacks inside the United States, roadside bombs, even car bombs?
Well, it's
given the numbers.
Given the numbers, I think that is the most likely type of attack that we would see in the United States is a very small scale, not necessarily a car bomb, but a small arms type attack, maybe something like what we saw in Paris. It seems, just given the numbers, it's very hard to be, as much as we strive to be 100% effective, right? It's very hard to always stop every one of these. And it is possible, it is possible that these individuals will adapt. We've seen already the groups themselves have adapted to saying, don't travel to Pakistan, don't travel to Yemen, carry out an attack wherever you are. So that's a adaptation to our defenses, and we've seen that already. And I would also say that we've also been less effective in the last couple of years at conducting surveillance. And that's also, the way we stop these attacks is not by seeing them when they're about to happen, but by seeing them long before they happen. And whether they're emanating out of Yemen or they're emanating, from someplace in the United States, we need to have the intelligence tools to conduct surveillance of individuals who are beginning to plot these attacks. And the earlier we can do that, the better. We're much better off if we're stopping an attack like that coming out of Yemen before an individual with an underwear bomb gets to the gate. Then we're going to have a much harder time stopping that.
Now the last figures were roughly 180 Americans thought to have traveled to Syria and back to the States. Do you think that's realistic?
Those numbers, I don't know the latest numbers. I know last I saw, there were certainly over 100 people who either gone or had tried to go. So I do think that those numbers seem about right to me, and they're going to continue. Look, we have to expect that they'll continue to go up over time, right? ISIS has proven to be extraordinarily adept at putting out a dual message, one that's hyper-violent, and then the other that's, we've created a caliphate here. This is the place to come. And that's having resonance.
One last question from the crowd. Tara.
Yes, I was just wondering. Tara Maller with the Aspen Institute in New America. I was wondering if you could comment, given your legal background and security background, there's been a lot of debate about what tech companies like Twitter and Facebook should be doing with regard to the ISIS propaganda and material that's online. Do you think these companies are doing enough? Should they be doing more? What should they be required to do? And the response from the tech companies has been that, with 290 million active users, is it actually realistic to expect them to be able to do some of this? And just legally, what should they be required or not required to do?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't purport to have all the answers to it. I do think that what I've seen in the past work, and I think it's actually relatively modest, which is to say that companies that provide a platform should enforce the terms of service that they have in place. And so if the FBI were to go to a company that is a social media platform and say, hey, this user is putting out beheading videos, or this user is using your platform to recruit or in a way that violates the company's own terms of service, what the rules are for using that particular service, then they should enforce it. And that seems at least like a start. And I get the challenge overall. It's not, there are lots of outlets and the numbers are huge, but there are instances where I think these companies can, again, very simply enforce the terms that they apply to all their users and enforce those in a way that's fair and even across the board, and that will result in at least some of these messages being taken down. It's not going to, look, I'm not naive about it totally, stopping the propaganda machine, whether it's ISIS or other groups.
Matt, thank you for taking our questions. Sure. Clark, thank you for inviting us. We'll see you on the road.
Thank you very much, Kimberly and Matt. Please join us now for a reception.
Yeah, my pleasure.